I will introduce myself now. Today I will speak on API design for Django and for its development. First of all, about myself. I've been dealing with web for quite a while now. Here are a couple of projects I've been part of. For the last 8 years or so, I've been using Python in my work. In addition, I also do open source. Here are the most famous libraries, such as Fancy and Eagle Chops. And now, getting back to API, certainly by now we have our ready-made solutions. The most well-known of them is Django REST framework, and there are some other framework products which are similar to each other in many respects. And in most cases, when we simply have to find a solution, and we have a ready-made solution, we do not invent code versions, but if we have time available to us, we might think of how it could be implemented and what are the reasons for it. Firstly, it is really interesting to engage in API design libraries. Secondly, we can look for a perfect solution. In fact, when we look at ready-made solutions and want to invent something of our own, based on our own solutions, when we look at the task, trying to visualize a perfect solution and then apply various compromises, we may move away from the ideal to some solution. And the last reason for doing it is that we can find the sources and origin of certain designers' solutions already available in the libraries. Besides that, there is a practical use case. It is non-REST API, and actually all the libraries are REST-based. And if you look at something different, then they could be too complicated for you. So I had a subtitle: how not to make another framework. What is meant by framework? A library is something where you are calling somebody else's code, and the framework is the inversion of control, in other words. So what's wrong about it? First of all, we write certain handlers all along, not starting from the topmost level, because it is hidden from us. As a result, we may not even fail to understand the logic there and use the template, which is only implemented by handlers. And if the template does not meet our requirements, we have a problem. And a more fundamental problem is that when we use a framework instead of language, we write in a certain sublanguage which reduces our understanding. So inversion of control is a bad thing. However, if we apply Python for web, that is to say, most probably Django, then inside inversion control, we are to write certain handlers. We can even write down a web without understanding how TCP works. On the one hand, it's bad. On the other hand, it can be good, because it makes it possible for us not to think about it. However, if our policy is avoiding control inversion, then what kind of measures are required to be based upon for developing API in libraries? and they are helpful themselves too. So we will keep avoiding control inversion to the extent possible. Now, we have a number of things that we will need from the library, and here is a plan of these things. First of all, we need some reading. We need pagination, content negotiation, routing, parsing, validation, and some other operations that we could designate as REST. Let's start with the simplest thing of all. It is reading and list. It is implemented in a very elementary way using Django. We don't need to add anything. We don't have a response. All we need is just to apply a number of things on the whole. We don't need to invent anything. Our next step is selecting fields. Here we can implement it just comparing it with our capabilities. Each time we opt for the simplest implementation, and up to the moment it didn't require any additional functionalities from us. Up to the moment, the easiest way was to use the available opportunities. But here we can put down, use the simplest solution for each step. Next thing that we need is excluding fields. We don't have built-in functionalities for this, but we can assume that we have a certain function and its implementation is quite simple. So we can consider it an advantage. That is to say, implementation simplicity matters. It matters because it makes handling the code easier, or it simplifies its making it more complicated. Now, then we can use a reset and helper and standard 404 from Django. And on the whole, it's all quite simple, even though there are a couple of issues. Number one is we get code duplication. If we have those two things, then the quality used is just the same in both cases. What we can do now, the simplest thing, is to take it away, to take it outside. We don't need any abstract resources, which is the case with frameworks implementing REST quite often. And this is something that we'll put down as our policy: avoid needless abstractions. In this case, we just took something away without adding resources. In addition, for query set as an entity which unites all the reading elements, we will need extra powers such as including fields, joins with renames, and mapping values. It can be a lot of small functions, or it can be a query set subclass with certain methods. In terms of simplicity, just the same, but in terms of easy handling, it is quite good for preparing query chain. And here we get here we had a couple of issues, including the fact that 404 would not work here in the way we had anticipated. Normally we would have JSON, but in this case getObject or 404 will be wrapped up in Django. First of all, we can actually forget about it, don't bother. Because if we use our own solution and not a library, then we actually don't care. Number two is we don't have to use exceptions. In that case, we would repeat the code. Then we could also use our own helper, and then we could intercept it in middleware and wrap it in the way we need. Let us now look at the interceptors capabilities. We could have a general type interceptor that would intercept the exceptions and wrap up the corresponding JSON and get object or 404 or some other standard message. It is another more flexible approach would be to use a special purpose interceptor. In this case, it makes sense to intercept initial exceptions we use here does not exist and then wrap it up using status 404. We can then try to write our own helper based on 404 to wrap up JSON already prepared, but it would not work with a built-in mechanism. We would need some decorator, which means that there are a couple of solutions that we would just leave aside because neither of them appears quite perfect. And now let's move on.
The easiest the easiest way is to send a request or to the page in the similar manner that we used before, and then to use JSON response. But there are exceptional situations. And we need to show 404 or 400 if there are some inadequate shifts. We can use exceptions, but in this case we will use the same problems when we were dealing with the 404. It's related to decorator, etc. Or we can take an alternative to the exceptions, and in this manner it is the return of the values. We have either result or error, and there might be a better version. We pack the response and we either get it through or we wrap it into the response. It will result in the repetition of the code, and we can add some helper. It might be JSON, which will be either send response or wrap it, and we get to the initial implementation, which is written in one line. It is possible to do that through helper, and in this way we don't need either the middleware or the decorator. So the advantage of such a helper is as follows. There are others. We can get OR 44 without exceptions, so that it is packing and ready to use response, and we can serialize what is not unserializable, the types, and it will be possible to reduce the number of the pre-tasking wrappings, or we can develop an API for this helper which will reduce the number of the brackets for us. We can make the shortcut to return the status of the errors. When we write in Django, it gravitates towards returning the HTML responses, and status is not important, but when we write an API, then those returns with the status will be more than normal ones, and so consequently we need to have the shortcut to write the return. and we can target our helper, tune our helper for this specific mission, and we can drop the brackets. And now content negotiation. And we get to the decorator that was used to intercept the exceptions, but in this case we use it to serialize the responses. If we want our response to be serialized in different ways, we can remove post-serialization from our processors and hand it to framework, to the library, or wherever. In this case, we make a response, and we could have used some kind of structure of data, but we need to transfer this data, and the decorator would be wrapping it, and in Django everything is decorated, and the response is from over there as well. Or we cannot we can do that without wrapping. In many cases it doesn't make any difference for our users whether it's JSON or not, and we can ignore that without making things complicated, and in this case we can do without hiding our intentions. Over here it is JSON, no surprises, but in the first case it is a response, and then there's a decorator which might add something, and so we don't hide our intentions. Next thing, routing. There's a standard solution in Django, and we can get the same things with functions and route them, and here is a small inversion of control in both options, and their complication is the same, and in the advantage of the second one, that these are simple functions that are easier to wrap. Another thing is parsing. Normally we could see in what manner regarding the JSON and to wrap it in a helper, or we can make a decorator that imparts such a feature. Both options, and the first is simpler, and in the other thing the data may be cached, and another benefit is that in the API view we don't know whether the data will be needed or not, and we should some feature and a wrap request, and we have such thing as wrapping request into its own class, and we have the data, and all the person is recharacterized. Validation. Next, we have a standard solution for validation. We write a code. It is adapted for working with API. 400 is bad request, and we deal with other things, and the first part will be repeated. All customization is done through form and its methods. So the first part could be hidden in the decorator, and in our view we work with the validated data, like saving them and returning the response. I come across such a solution in one of the frameworks, but there is a disadvantage, and a couple of things are different in the API. That should have been validated with a number of Django things. And there are some typical data in JSON. All those fields could be used, but if not, we can implement our own field, and this structure could be nested. And the situation is simpler because our models are flat. On the other hand, we can make our own fields like JSON or array fields, and they will validate the nested structure. But we lose control in this case. For Django form, we can have either the number as text if we need control. The forms are no good. We should make our own form, and Django frameworks do that. Authorization. We wish would have an interface that we know from Django. We cannot use standard decorators because they are related to HTML, redirects, and on authorization through Django, and we might need some different authorizations, but we can mimic it, and we request authorization and some rights. It looks different in Django framework. We have a view and we have classes of permission. And API view, it is a substitute to request. It's not only parsing that is different, but we have a user. When there is an access to user, the authorization is not through standard Django elf, but through Django some work and through its classes that are defined by settings, and we demand it through rights. And we use classes in Django, and consequently the permissions cover all the classes, all the methods, and it might generate the start of this combination explosion. We demand authentication for the node, but not for writing, but nothing for reading. Had we used decorators, we wouldn't have that kind of problems. But in this case, no serious problem develops because we don't need something different things for different methods. It is enough to differentiate between read and write. However, working with functions would be easier than working with this class. That's how we could have, or instead of post, put, delete, we could have used write. In this case, we could split access. If in this case it is one, and the mission is in this class. Over here we do it separately, and we can do without factoring. And the last but not the least is arrest. Arrest is fundamentally repeats itself at the top level of logics, like renewals and deleting, and any attempt to summarize the code results in abstraction of the logic of the upper level, and we start writing framework. If on top of it we will be implementing REST, it will be Django REST framework, which uses something again instead of form serialization. So if we need a REST, it is easier to use DRF. That's it, nothing to comment. If DRF for us is too cumbersome, we can use this particular thing, the library from the helpers that I have listed. I have wrapped it in DJPI, or we can use Django, organic standard means, and tune to the settings that I have mentioned. That is, avoiding inversion of controls, then needless abstractions, don't hide intentions, use the simplest solution, and see to it that the implementation is simple. Thank you. Questions? Thanks for your talk. If the number of the objects in the project in the API exceed 100,000, we realize that it's not possible to engineer it in Postgres. It lists all the objects one after another, and it is dozens and hundreds of seconds, and we redeveloped the API to work with the dashes, like to get all the objects starting from a particular date. Is there any possibilities to get to the classical model in the API? It is related not only to the API, but to the pages in the regular HTML. And there are solutions with the cursors or memorizing the previous position. If we do not allow to get the offset, we can make a reference to the next page after the first one, and we deal with the ID.
And then in this link we start with the ID. It's a kind of cursor, but the advantage is that no data are stored on the server, and if there is any data left there, it would be working better, because the page with offsets would be working worse if the data changes, or we could get some duplicates. But it hasn't got anything to do with API. It's just a general common problem. Could you express your opinion about the link between permissions and particular REST API method? Is it good or bad? At our project, we gave up the idea of linking permissions to methods because it complicates the design too strongly. I'll just get back a bit. What about this picture? It's an owl sitting on a globe. With this owl, we try to put certain actions of a HTTP on something which was not designed for this purpose. And so if we do it, it's just similar to having an owl over the globe. And if we look at the techniques used, the reading, writing, deletion, it depends on your application only. My question is as follows. Maybe I just misunderstood your idea or did not understand it quite correctly. At the beginning, you had a set of methods which, to my mind, aimed at taking out certain common elements. But why couldn't you use object images? What kind of object images do you mean? I mean, why is it that your approach is not based on object images? so that you could use all the advantages of object-oriented programming, because we didn't need it. One function is simpler than that method. It is the function which does not return exceptions is even simpler. That is to say, if we are able to solve a task using just one function only, this is what we will do. But for convenience, we could call it a universal class, and then we could implement it using it in old Pi. Well, we could actually argue about it, but the class is just one version. Normally, we have a template where we predetermine the methods, and then once again we are called. We may not understand what is going on the block. With Django, we have the top-level logic, but if we try to move to a higher level and also add our own framework, we hide the logic, and there is nothing good about it. That's why when we implement REST, we practically and inevitably arrive at a framework. But if we implement a library for a particular API, we do not need any class at all. We can use Django views and then just take out certain repeated pieces. And now we are trying to invent something so that the functions do not become painful for us. Don't you think we would need a class there? We will arrive at the need for classes, just like the cases with the REST API. But normally with classes it is easier to get things done. But we might think about it, how to make the framework better. I don't know really. Okay, I want to give a follow-up to this idea. Any more questions? There are no more questions, then thank you very much once again for your presentation.